Hello again. Today's story is one of the most graphic stories I have covered on this channel. Please be warned that this story includes descriptions of murder, abuse, cannibalism, and disturbing details of human remains. While I will not go into the most graphic details, the case itself involves sensitive and unsettling material that some listeners may find distressing. But before we start, please comment down where you are from and what time it is, and like the video. Let's get to it. A neighbor calls the police to report a blocked pipe. When asked what was clogging it, he casually replies, "Guts." That one word sent investigators rushing upstairs, where they discovered something chilling inside a man's tiny apartment, a refrigerator filled with human flesh. But who was this man? And how had he been killing in silence for over 20 years without being caught? This case isn't just about murder. It's about how a quiet neighbor became one of Germany's most infamous serial killers. This is the story of Joachim Kroll, the Ruhr Cannibal. How could one casual remark unravel a decades-long killing spree? It began with something that should have been simple, a household problem. A neighbor in the Ruhr region noticed that the pipes in his building were blocked. At first, it looked like a standard maintenance issue. Water was rising back into the sinks and baths. Like most people would, he called for help, expecting nothing more than a plumber and maybe a small cleanup. The last thing anyone could imagine was that this blockage would lead police to one of the most disturbing cases in Germany's history. When officers arrived, the mood was ordinary. They were not there for a criminal investigation, but for what seemed to be routine assistance. Pipes clogged all the time in crowded post-war apartment blocks. Landlords cut costs, repairs lagged, and tenants dealt with frequent plumbing complaints. So the police came along, listening casually as the tenant explained the problem. It only turned dark when they asked the question no one thought twice about. What exactly was stuck in the pipe? The neighbor's reply left them silent. He simply said, "Guts." At first, it did not seem real. People sometimes exaggerate or say odd things when frustrated. But this did not sound like a joke, and his expression carried no humor. The word cut through the ordinary setting and made everyone stop. The officers glanced at each other. A blocked pipe might mean food scraps, grease, or old debris. But guts? That changed everything. What had just been a building repair had now stepped into very different territory. The officers decided to take it seriously. Their training urged them to act when something did not add up. If it turned out the tenant exaggerated, it would be an inconvenience. Yet, if not, ignoring it could mean missing something serious. They pushed for more clarity, but the man's flat delivery gave them no reassurance. The word hung heavy in the room, forcing the investigation upward into the apartments themselves. When the police walked the stairs to the floor above, it was no longer about plumbing. They knew they were stepping towards something darker, though the scale of it had not yet dawned on them. Situations like this have appeared before in criminal history. A casual word here, an offhand observation there, and suddenly an investigation opens wide. In the case of Dennis Nilsson in London, complaints about plumbing led officials to discover human remains in drains as well. The ordinary world of household repairs had, more than once, cracked open the door to atrocities hidden in plain sight. And here, in this small town apartment block, that same pattern was repeating. The police knocked on the door of a tenant named Joachim Kroll. He lived alone in a modest flat. When he opened the door, he did not seem threatening. A small man, pale, with an unassuming manner. The officers entered and soon found what would confirm the neighbor's chilling claim. Inside Kroll's kitchen sat a refrigerator, and in it, preserved body parts. In drawers, investigators uncovered pieces of flesh, prepared as if they were leftovers. A cooking pot on the stove still showed traces of what had been boiled only recently. Suddenly, the word guts was not an exaggeration. It was the precise truth. The ordinary building complaint had pulled back the curtain and revealed not only one killing, but the buried evidence of many. In moments like this, the distance between ordinary life and horror collapses. One door, one casual conversation, and the reality that unfolds is almost impossible for outsiders to imagine. From this point on, the investigation shifted entirely. Officers who began their day expecting a plumbing job now found themselves inside the apartment of a serial murderer. The preserved body parts made it clear that these were not isolated acts. The case files would later show the depth of the crimes, stretching back 2 decades, tied together not by careful police work, but by a clogged pipe and a neighbor's blunt remark. In criminal history, this is not unusual. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from small, almost mundane details. The capture of the BTK killer in Kansas only became possible because of a digital misstep involving a floppy disk. In the case of Richard Trenton Chase, neighbors noticed odd smells and complaints of strange waste before the police investigated. Again and again, killers who moved unnoticed in society were finally discovered because of something that seemed unrelated to crime itself. Human error, arrogance, or chance can take years of secrecy and drag it unexpectedly into the light. For Joachim Kroll, one of Germany's most elusive killers, the turning point came not through a planned investigation, but through something as random as a pipe blockage. The neighbor could have described it any other way, but his choice of words, plain and unsettling, forced officers to look closer. And because they did, they opened one of the most disturbing chapters in German criminal history. Inside the apartment, police had now gathered enough proof that speculation was no longer possible. Between the remains in the fridge, the pot on the stove, and the other evidence scattered in bags and drawers, it was beyond doubt someone had been killed, dismembered, and stored within this home. Questions of if disappeared, leaving only how many. Each room carried clues, reinforcing that this was no single act, but the work of someone who had been at it for years. For the community that lived in the building, the shock would have been overwhelming. The ordinary man they passed in stairwells and at bus stops had been hiding body parts behind his kitchen door. Residents had gone about their lives, never suspecting that their plumbing problem would connect to such horror. The contrast between the plain nature of the complaint and the grotesque truth inside is what still makes this discovery unforgettable. In the days that followed, police began piecing together just how extensive Kroll's record of killings had become. He sat quietly and confirmed some of the suspicions, referencing murders stretching back years. What began as a clogged drain had now unraveled over 20 years of violence, including cases of murder and child abuse. Each confession added another piece of horror to the puzzle, and officers began realizing that this unremarkable man had lived among them while committing acts that defied comprehension. This was the moment where illusion shattered. Kroll had not lived as a monster in the eyes of neighbors. He had been odd, yes, but harmless in their view. His apartment proved otherwise, and with the discovery of flesh prepared like meals, the story of this man would become fixed in the press under a single name, the Ruhr Cannibal. What had started with drains and casual assumptions now turned into headlines across the country. But beyond the grisly shock, one question continued to linger. Who exactly was Joachim Kroll? How had he concealed such violence for so long behind his quiet facade? The investigation of his apartment gave police their evidence of horror, but it did not yet answer the question of the man himself. To begin understanding that, you would have to look past the crime scene and into the life of the man living behind that door. His strange, silent presence in the neighborhood was not just habit or shyness. It was cover for decades of killing carried out in silence. And so, the true story of Joachim Kroll begins with the man the neighbors thought they knew, but never really did. How did a man working as a factory hand keep such a double life? On the surface, Joachim Kroll looked like anyone else in the crowded neighborhoods of the Ruhr Valley. He was a small, quiet man who kept to himself and rarely sparked attention. People passing him in the stairwell or on the street would not have considered him dangerous. He was simply another tenant in an ordinary industrial town, a place where lives often revolved around long shifts, small apartments, and modest routines. Neighbors later recalled him as odd, but not threatening. He spoke little, kept his voice low, and seemed almost shy when approached. He did not drink heavily at local bars like many of the men in his community, nor did he cause fights or loud arguments. If anything, his presence blended into the background of the working-class landscape in post-war Germany. He wore plain clothes, walked quietly, and gave little reason for suspicion. People found him strange, but harmless enough. Kroll's work life added to this impression. His first job was as a public toilet attendant, a position requiring little interaction and offering only modest pay. The job carried no prestige, but in a society rebuilding after the war, employment of any kind was valuable. Later, he managed to secure work at Thyssen Steel, one of the largest employers in the Ruhr. Shifts in the steel industry were long and physically demanding, but it gave him stability and a reason for people not to pry into his life. To co-workers, he was quiet, sometimes peculiar, but he did his job. He was not skilled, nor admired, but he showed up, and that alone offered cover. In a region dominated by heavy industry, thousands of men had lives just like his. They woke, worked their shifts, and went home to small rented apartments. Some maintained families, others lived alone, but the rhythm was steady and predictable. For Kroll, this backdrop gave him shelter. Where other killers have drawn attention by being charismatic or by acting suspicious, Kroll survived by being unremarkable. The very lack of spark or personality meant people rarely remembered details about him. At home, his life remained equally uneventful in the eyes of others. His apartment showed little about who he was. The few neighbours who ever went inside described it as dull and poorly furnished. There were no visitors or parties. He lived alone, cooked his meals, and kept mostly to his own company. For years, this sort of life kept any unwanted attention away from him. He was the quiet neighbour others ignored. Research on criminal offenders has shown that many who evade capture for long periods do so by keeping themselves shielded under routine. Law enforcement often relies on patterns that stand out, but those who stick to dull jobs and regular activities attract little interest. In one study of long-term offenders, criminologists noted that maintaining an ordinary facade can effectively hide deviant behaviour. For police at the time, with fewer tools for central record-keeping and less communication between districts, there was little to indicate that a man like Kroll could be dangerous. Co-workers sometimes whispered about his odd mannerisms. He did not socialise after work, avoided humour, and sometimes appeared detached. Even so, his strangeness was brushed aside as awkwardness. In working-class communities, where exhaustion and personal troubles were common, the behaviour of one solitary man rarely stood out as a cause for alarm. People assumed he might simply be lonely or unhappy, but not violent. This invisibility is striking when you consider the scale of what he was concealing. Over 2 decades, Kroll committed a series of murders, yet during that time, none of the people who crossed paths with him connected his vacant manner to the violence that followed him. In court records, this came to be seen as one of the most disturbing aspects of his story, that he thrived by appearing harmless. Through all those years, he carried on in much the same way each day: go to work, return home, prepare modest meals, keep conversation minimal. His plain lifestyle offered him both convenience and camouflage. Because he lacked signs of wealth, there was no jealousy or resentment among neighbours. Because he did not stir trouble, there were no arguments that placed him under suspicion. Because he worked simple jobs, there was nothing in his background that drew police attention. It is worth considering how different his life looked compared to other notorious killers. Some displayed erratic temper, others strange collections, and some revealed violent traits that alarmed peers. But for Kroll, there was none of this in the open. His disguise was not one he constantly adjusted or carefully crafted, but one that existed naturally in his muted character and his routine labourer's life. He went unnoticed because there was so little about him to focus on. The Ruhr region, during the 1950s to 1970s, was packed with workers like him, moving city to city depending on which steel mill or factory offered shifts. Kroll fit seamlessly into this environment. His travels between different towns to commit murders mirrored the natural movement of labourers seeking constant pay, and this further helped him avoid notice. Each jurisdiction saw violence without connecting it to the quiet man travelling with the tides of industry. Police later noted how extraordinary it was that he used such ordinary employment as his greatest shield. He had no special skills that kept him above suspicion, no charm to draw sympathy, only the plainness of a man no one thought about twice. His life was evidence of how harmful invisibility could become. The absence of red flags gave him cover for years, while others, wrongfully accused, paid the price for his crimes. For the families who later learned that a man like Kroll had been walking the same streets as they had, the shock cut deep. He was not hiding in abandoned houses or operating in shadows. He was taking the bus to work like anyone else, waiting in line at local shops, nodding politely in shared stairwells. It showed that danger sometimes hides not in distant strangers, but in the person whose face becomes so ordinary, it fades into the background. In hindsight, his harmless image was one of his greatest weapons. Neighbours saw strangeness, employers saw mediocrity, but no one saw the predator masked under those layers of dullness. As investigators pieced together his past, the discovery was not only that he had killed many times, but that each time, his camouflage of ordinariness shielded him from suspicion. Kroll was not simply an odd neighbour, he was a man who shaped his entire existence around invisibility. From dim apartments, simple jobs, and wordless routines, he built a shield that lasted more than 20 years. And behind that shield, he was carrying out acts that shocked an entire country once the truth came to light. To understand how a man like this reached the point where such crimes became part of his life, you have to go further back. His childhood, shaped in the shattered landscape of post-war Germany, carried signs that the world at the time dismissed. Those years, marked by poverty, isolation, and dark habits, planted the seeds of what would later become his crimes, including murder and child abuse. What childhood signs hinted at violence years before the murders? To understand where Joachim Kroll's secret life began, you have to start in the years right after World War II. His family was originally from Zabrze, a city in Upper Silesia, that ended up on the Polish side of the border when the war ended. Like many ethnic Germans living there, the Kroll family faced displacement. They relocated west into Germany, settling in the Ruhr area, a region already struggling with bomb damage, food shortages, and too many people fighting to survive in small, crowded housing. This was the world young Joachim entered, a world of poverty, instability, and scarcity. He was the youngest of 8 children in the family. That meant attention from parents was limited, and it also meant competition for food, clothing, and even space. Accounts suggest that he quickly fell behind in school. Teachers noted that he had trouble learning to read and write at the same pace as his classmates. At a time when education was seen as a bridge out of wartime poverty, his poor performance only pushed him further into isolation. While other boys formed bonds in the classroom or on playgrounds, Joachim was sidelined, often the one picked last or ignored completely. This lack of acceptance at school carried into social life outside classrooms. Some peers bullied him, calling him simple-minded or strange. He lacked the social skills to fight back or defend himself. Over time, this rejection deepened into loneliness. He had very few friends and spent long hours away from others. When he did interact, his responses were awkward, which only gave his peers more reason to push him aside. By adolescence, he was largely locked out of the normal social fabric of youth. It was around this time that troubling behaviors began to appear. He developed an unusual fascination with dolls, objects most adolescent boys left behind long before. Unlike ordinary play, his games with dolls often involved tearing them apart or cutting into them. For him, the act of dismantling or damaging carried a strange satisfaction. This behavior hints at an early connection between control and destruction, one that would later take on a much darker expression. Psychologists who study early warning signs in offenders point out that cruelty toward objects can be an early step in practicing harmful fantasies. Kroll did not stand out as violent toward animals, but his destructive games with dolls offered him a private outlet. He rehearsed control in ways that gave him a kind of hidden identity. These acts, performed alone and away from his peers, marked the gradual shift from typical childhood curiosity into something that foreshadowed dangerous adult behavior. As puberty arrived, his isolation grew heavier. He felt desire and frustration, but lacked any real-world opportunity for intimacy or friendship. Already awkward, he was rejected by girls his age, and his failures left him humiliated. In that vacuum of real experiences, fantasy became his constant companion. Unlike typical adolescent imagination, his fantasies involved harm and violence. He associated desire with dominance and control, rather than connection or tenderness. The isolation and bullying had created a space where his private world flourished unchecked. Then came a major turning point. In 1955, Joachim's mother died. For many in large families, mothers served as the anchor, the one who provided order, food, comfort, and a sense of belonging. In Kroll's case, her death left him stripped of even the fragile center he had. Already detached, now he lost the only figure who had given consistent care. Accounts suggest that this hit him deeply, perhaps more than it did others in the family. Without her, he sank further into emptiness, relying almost entirely on fantasies that spiraled in darker directions. Criminologists have long linked childhood trauma, whether neglect, bullying, or the loss of a key parent, to later patterns of violent crime. Not every child who faces difficulty turns violent, but when these factors combine with psychological vulnerabilities, they can create pathways where deviant thinking grows unchecked. In Kroll's case, the combination of displacement, ongoing rejection, limited intelligence, and traumatic loss laid down a pattern that deepened as he aged. His peers may not have known the full extent. To them, he remained the strange, quiet boy who played on the margins. But inside his private world, boundaries had already tipped. He was moving from simple acts with dolls toward fantasies of control over others. His thoughts meshed desire with violence, and since he had no real relationships to counterbalance them, they grew uninhibited. He found excitement, not in closeness, but in images of overpowering and harming. Researchers describe this spiral as the merging of desire with personal frustration. For Joachim, each failure with peers gave more energy to his inner fantasies. At the same time, his sense of powerlessness in daily life, being rejected and behind in school, created a need to imagine power somewhere. That power expressed itself in violent imagination, with domination as its core. What had started with scissors and a doll became something that centered on people. By his late teens, those fantasies had formed a rhythm. He was still invisible in the outside world, working odd jobs and staying in cramped housing. But privately, the images dominated his mind. The loss of his mother may have removed the one tether he had to stability. When she died, the balance tipped. Within months, he would commit his first known murder. The timing was not coincidence. With fantasy having no counterweight, and with loneliness pressing harder, the bridge between thought and action weakened until it disappeared. His childhood story shows a steady chain from ordinary hardship to extraordinary violence. Poverty, social rejection, and traumatic loss created conditions where fantasy overtook reality. His fascination with damaging objects became a rehearsal, and his inner life developed in secrecy, while his outer life remained quiet and overlooked. In hindsight, the signs point to someone drawing links between desire and violence long before his crimes began. What began as isolation and destructive play was about to become lethal. The moment of escalation, the point where he moved from imagination to action, was approaching. Within a year of his mother's death, the fantasies of adolescence turned into the murder of a young woman. That act marked the moment where his troubled childhood ended, and his life as a killer began. Once it started, the pattern across the Ruhr would become unmistakable. How does someone take the first step from fantasy to killing? For Joachim Kroll, that step came in 1955. Only months after the death of his mother, he carried out his first known murder. The victim was Irmgard Strahl, a 19-year-old woman who lived in the region. What began in his mind as dark fantasy now crossed into reality. After years of obsession and escalating urges, he attacked her with an intensity that revealed the path he had been traveling in private. Her death signaled not only his first confirmed crime, but also the start of a pattern stretching across more than 2 decades. The killing shocked the community. Germany in the mid-1950s was rebuilding from the devastation of war, and places like the Ruhr Valley looked forward to ordinary life again. Factories opening, families re-establishing, neighborhoods regaining rhythm. The violence that erupted with Strahl's murder felt entirely out of step with that atmosphere. Young people walked the streets of small towns with a sense that society had shifted back to peace. Then, news spread that a woman had been murdered. The unease rippled outward, not only for her family but for neighbors who could not imagine such cruelty in a time believed to be calmer. For Kroll, one murder was not enough. In 1956, he struck again. This time the victim was Erika Schuletter, another young woman whose disappearance and death unsettled her community. The circumstances resembled his first act, though investigators did not yet see them as connected. Local police treated each killing as an isolated tragedy. Tragic, but solvable, if the right lead emerged. Without digital records or inter-district communication, the link between 2 crimes in nearby areas was invisible to them. Officers worked each case as if it stood alone, never realizing that across towns, the same man stalked victims unnoticed. His next known victim came in 1959, 24-year-old Clara Tesma. 3 women dead in 4 years might seem to form a pattern, but at the time, police across these jurisdictions did not compare detailed notes. Each town, or district, handled cases within its own borders. A murder near Duisburg carried no immediate weight with investigators in Essen or other areas of the Ruhr. As a result, while Kroll had already defined his method, authorities saw no larger picture. Each act was tragic, but none seemed to signal a serial killer moving silently among ordinary towns. The lack of pattern recognition opened the door to tragic mistakes. In the aftermath of Tesma's murder, investigators thought they had their man. A local, Heinrich Ott, was arrested in connection with her death. Public pressure demanded resolution. Rural towns and industrial centres alike feared the impact of unsolved murders. When Ott was accused, many were quick to believe the case had been answered. But it had not, and the consequences of that mistake were devastating. Ott, under the weight of suspicion and bleak prospects for proving his innocence, eventually took his own life. The real killer, meanwhile, carried on, unnoticed and unchallenged. Another arrest, another wrongful suspicion, followed in time with a different case. In Duisburg, police focused their attention on a young man named Walter Quicker, believing he was responsible for one of the murders. With little structure for sharing case information, each police force pursued its own angles, convinced they had credible suspects. Shortages of manpower and resources kept investigators desperate. Under pressure from the wider public, who demanded answers for women turning up dead, the wrong names became easy targets. Each misstep meant that Kroll had more time to commit crimes without interference. The fact that the early murders were misattributed shows how well he escaped notice during his prime. Moving from town to town within the Ruhr mimicked the travels of many ordinary workers. The whole valley was an interconnected series of industrial cities. People often lived in one town, worked in another, and visited relatives distributed across the region. For Kroll, This allowed him to attack in varying locations while blending into normal movement. Each crime happened in a different place, diffusing suspicion and making it difficult to imagine one perpetrator responsible for them all. The illusion that these attacks were unrelated grew stronger as years passed between some of the early killings. Police expected patterns to be rapid, killers repeating victims in consistent ways or in close geographic areas. But when months or even years stretched between crimes, and each one occurred in different towns, their instinct was to treat them separately. In the absence of direct evidence tying them together, the very idea of a single predator did not gain a foothold. By the time any such theory could appear, innocent names were already attached to the crimes, and their lives altered forever. Kroll benefited directly from these failures. While others endured suspicion, he moved quietly through his meager daily routines. Authorities had no reason to connect the quiet man who checked in at simple jobs to the violence scattered across the region. He had no arrests to his name, no dramatic behavior that drew official attention, and no ties strong enough to point him to victims. He exploited the structure of law enforcement and the assumptions of his time. Town-based investigations and uncoordinated record-keeping gave him freedom to expand his pattern without being noticed. It is striking to look back and realize that the Ruhr Valley was in effect the hunting ground for a predator few suspected to exist. Ordinary workers crossed the same streets, families raised children in nearby apartments, couples enjoyed post-war leisure, while a killer traced his own path around them. The women he targeted represented the opportunity his urges demanded. With each murder accepted as an isolated case, the opportunities multiplied. Communities mourned, police blamed suspects in reach, and Kroll walked free. These early murders reveal more than the beginning of a killing career. They also show how structural weaknesses in society, in law enforcement, and in communities allowed one man to pass unseen. When Ott died in custody, his story became a grim reminder that the wrong man's punishment does not stop a killer. The true threat kept moving, as Kroll did, to the next city or the next victim. Decades later, these mistakes formed part of the stain upon the record of police work in the Ruhr. At this early stage, the world only knew the horror of women dead without explanation. It did not know what Joachim Kroll was truly doing to them. Death was not the end of his actions, it was the beginning. What came after killing would reveal Kroll's crimes as among the most disturbing in history. Beyond strangulation and control, his acts would cross into areas few killers even approached. Nobody in those first years suspected that one drifter between towns, a quiet and awkward man tied to low-paying jobs, was responsible for multiple deaths. Nobody thought of one travelling killer, and the ones who might have spoken against suspicion, the wrongly accused, could not, silenced instead by wrongful blame. How much further would he go, and what would make this man so much more than just a murderer? The answer lay in what he did next, acts that set him apart from others and gave him his infamous reputation. What twisted rituals followed his killings? For Joachim Kroll, strangulation became the act he returned to most often. It was quiet, required little planning, and gave him the personal control he wanted over his victims. By cutting off their breath with his hands or a simple piece of fabric, he could feel the life leave them while watching their final movements. For others, this method might seem brutal in its intimacy, but for Kroll, it was central to the way he approached murder. Each time, it placed him directly over his victim, in control and in command of their body, in a way that fit with the fantasies he had nurtured for years. Once the killing was done, though, the crime did not stop there. For him, death was only the beginning of another process. He stripped the bodies of clothing, leaving them naked, which further reinforced his sense of domination. These moments were not just to humiliate or conceal, they provided him with direct access, which he then used to act out sexual behaviors tied to his darker compulsions. In some cases, investigators found signs that he had sexually assaulted the corpses. In others, his activity was not physical penetration, but masturbation over the body, a ritual that became a repeated hallmark of his crimes. This ritual was about more than release. It was about turning victims into objects that served his personal needs long after they had been silenced. By using corpses in this way, whether directly or through fantasy-driven interaction, he reinforced the merging of violence and sexuality that had been building since childhood. Each crime gave him an arena to act on those compulsions in real life, no longer confined to imagination. Each repetition strengthened the bond between killing, control, and sexual gratification, creating a cycle difficult for him to stop. At his apartment, another object reflected the same pattern. Police discovered a rubber sex doll that he used often when victims were out of reach. To many, it seemed grotesque, but for Kroll, the doll was a substitute body. It allowed him to continue his rituals when he had not found an opportunity to kill. For a man as socially cut off as he was, It served as both a prop for fantasy and a reminder of what he sought whenever he went looking for victims outside his home. The line between reality and his imagination blurred further because of these constant rehearsals. Psychologists later studying his behavior described these acts as ritual-driven. Every crime followed a clear script that he rarely strayed from. First, strangulation, then undressing, then sexual behavior, either direct or symbolic. Finally, mutilation of the body. Each stage was an anchor in his routine, and each added to the sense of completion he felt. Rituals like this are not random. They are compulsions rooted deeply in the mind of an offender. Once established, stepping away from them often leaves the person unsatisfied. For Kroll, these repeated actions were not only expressions of desire, but steps he believed necessary to achieve the emotional result he wanted. The repetition also revealed how little his crimes were about the individual victim. Each person represented the same role in his process. They functioned as interchangeable figures in a script written long before the encounter. When police later questioned him, it became clear that he did not speak much of his victims as people, but as parts of his cycle. The obsession was over the act, not the identity. Every detail of his behavior pointed back to this. He was fixated not on who the victim was, but on how the ritual played out. The most disturbing element came last. Once the bodies had served their role in his sexual compulsion, Kroll turned to acts of mutilation. He did not simply leave them where they lay, nor did he always flee in a hurry. He cut strips of flesh from certain parts of their bodies, usually from the thighs or buttocks. These cuts were methodical, and evidence showed that the parts were taken away in bags or wrapped carefully before being brought back to his apartment. At home, those pieces revealed a new layer of ritual. They were not trophies placed on display or hidden souvenirs. They were food. Kroll cooked them, sometimes boiling, other times frying, treating the human flesh as though it were meat from a local butcher. In one confession, he suggested that using victims this way saved him trips to the grocery store. That statement shocked investigators, who realized the killings were not only tied to sexual gratification, but blended with his everyday survival routines. To him, it was practical. Another step in a process where killing became part of daily life itself. This union of necrophilia and cannibalism placed him in a rare category of offenders. While sexual violence and even ritualized behavior appear in many cases, few go as far as consuming victims. For Kroll, the compulsion had extended past the body in front of him and into the most ordinary space of life, food. By reducing victims to meals, he showed an ability to normalize his crimes to himself, treating flesh as both sustenance and trophy. The dual use reinforced his sense of control and extended it into every corner of his existence. For investigators who pieced this together, the pattern revealed an offender whose killings could not be separated from his everyday behavior. Each part of his crime flowed into the next: strangulation, sexual ritual, mutilation, cooking. The order repeated itself again and again, across different towns and different years. When the rituals grew too strong to hold back with only a doll in his apartment, he sought out the next victim. Whenever he fulfilled the process, he carried remnants home, storing them in a refrigerator as if they were leftovers. The structure of his rituals explains why he persisted for so long. Without them, he may have lost interest. With them, he reinforced a system that met psychological needs in powerful ways. Murder became his central act, the one place where his loneliness, frustration, sexual urges, and hunger were all answered as part of one sequence. For someone with such little stability in relationships and society, these rituals acted as an anchor that gave him consistency. To break them would be to lose the only form of control he had created for himself. Strangulation, necrophilia, and ritualized masturbation were only part of the story. His act of mutilating bodies, cutting them open, and cooking parts at home carried the process one step further into territory that filled investigators with horror. For Joachim Kroll, the act of killing had crossed boundaries rarely seen. Death for his victims did not mean the end of the crime. It meant transformation into an object of consumption. This was the point where murder and cannibalism were tied together in a way that would define his name forever in the public record. The rituals had revealed themselves fully. Kroll was not simply a murderer. He was now the figure the press would call the Ruhr Cannibal. Why would someone begin eating human flesh? For many killers, the act of murder is the end. But for Joachim Kroll, the end was only part of what he wanted. After strangling his victims and acting out his rituals with their bodies, he began cutting them apart with calm routine. His focus was not random. He often sliced meat from the thighs and buttocks, wrapping the cuts up carefully to take back to his small apartment. What followed gave him the title he is known by today, He cooked the human flesh as if it were any other meal, boiling, frying, or stewing it on the same stove his neighbors used for sausages and potatoes. When investigators later searched his kitchen, they found these remains preserved like leftovers. What shocked them most was not only the evidence of mutilation, but the reason Kroll himself gave. He calmly explained that he had eaten human flesh to save money on groceries. To him, killing was tied into his daily routine. He framed his acts of cannibalism as though they were practical decisions. It was not an act of insanity or wild hunger. It was, in his mind, a solution. That statement left authorities shaking their heads. They had expected something twisted yet dramatic. What they received instead was a plain, almost domestic logic that made the crime even more unsettling. At the time, Germany was still recovering from the hardships of war. The Ruhr was an industrial region where working families lived with modest means. Wages were low, apartments were small, and communities often pooled resources just to survive. Families stretched meat into stews, reused leftovers, and rationed what they bought. In this setting, Kroll carried his warped answer to the problem of food shortages. Where others tightened their belts or relied on extended family, he used victims as his food. By forcing this ordinary hardship into his justification, he disguised the darkest act as something practical. He told investigators that his meals of human flesh reduced costs, framing cannibalism as thrift. The explanation revealed his state of mind. He did not see cannibalism as something monstrous or even shameful. He explained it without expression, as though describing how to save money during a trip to the market. Investigators were not dealing with a man overcome by hunger. They were standing across from someone who had woven murder into his view of everyday life. His words showed the crime was not driven by desperate need. Instead, it was driven by rationalization. He found a reason that worked for him, no matter how grotesque it sounded to others, and used it to silence any inner conflict. This rationalization is something criminologists point to in many offenders with long histories. They create stories that allow them to carry on without breaking under guilt. For Kroll, the story went like this. Killing provided not only sexual gratification but also food, and therefore savings. It gave his compulsions a layer of justification. By presenting himself as practical, he could explain what otherwise had no rational base. This made him dangerous in a different way. He was not driven into chaos. He was working with a personal logic that made sense only to him and left room for repetition, again and again. Another effect of this cannibalism was concealment. By taking body parts home and using them in meals, he eliminated some of the remains that could later reveal his crimes. What he did not eat immediately could be stored in his refrigerator, extending evidence into longer use but also keeping parts of the crime invisible. For police investigations already struggling to link cases, this removal of flesh added another obstacle. A body left behind with sections missing immediately confused investigators. They did not always know what had been done and why. That confusion delayed progress and gave Kroll more time to continue, confident that his habits did not expose him. The cannibalism also blurred the line between crime and routine life. Most killers work to separate acts of violence from their personal space. They hide evidence, mask scents, and attempt to distance home from murder. Kroll did the opposite. His home life and killer life overlapped. The same table where he ate his meals became the place where victim flesh appeared on plates. His refrigerator, meant for milk, eggs, and bread, carried sealed cuts of human meat. This overlap meant he carried the crime into every corner of his days, erasing the difference between what his neighbors considered normal and what he practiced. For neighbors, nothing seemed unusual. They smelled cooking from his window like any other flat. They saw him carry groceries, never suspecting that his bag might also hold something else. He was not roasting large sections, but cooking small cuts that would not seem out of place to anyone glancing in. In that sense, cannibalism gave him a way to merge his crimes with ordinary life. He did not need to hide strange trophies or travel with suspicious objects. He turned his victims into meals, blending their remains into settings so ordinary that even he treated them as routine. When he confessed to these acts, investigators and psychologists struggled with how to interpret him. Some wanted to see insanity, pointing to the disturbing nature of his rituals, but his explanation did not reflect madness in the traditional sense. His calm voice, his use of terms like saving money, all suggested practical thinking. It pulled his crimes away from the realm of psychotic breaks and into something colder. He was not detached from reality. He was shaping reality to fit his compulsions. That is why his words still stand out. He was not shouting about visions or voices. He was talking about shopping and groceries. In cases across criminal history, the act of eating victims has often been linked to deep psychological disturbance, sometimes framed as symbolism or delusion. In Kroll's case, the framing was different. He did not speak of spirits or ritual meaning, he spoke of meals. It was not insanity's chaos, but a chilling pragmatism. He told officers, without hesitation, that eating people was cheaper for him. The horror was not only what he had done, but the ordinariness of the reason he used. As investigators pushed him for details, they began piecing together how widespread this practice had become. Each killing linked to him carried the question of whether he had cut meat for later meals. The sheer size of his confession list left officers wondering how much of it he had carried home in his shopping bags. Every recipe he mentioned, every pan left in his kitchen, every pot on his stove carried weight. What might have looked like leftovers was now understood as evidence of years-long consumption. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. Kroll's cannibalism did not come from hunger, groceries alone, or poverty. It came from a mind that had wired itself to see victims as both sexual objects and as food. He could justify it with words about saving money, but in reality, he had merged survival with killing so closely that the acts supported each other. Murder relieved him, and cooking the victims made it easier to continue, convincing him that what he had done had additional benefits. That way of thinking is what unsettled investigators the most. They were staring at a man who was not incoherent or lost in madness, but someone who had made killing part of his logic. They came to understand that his reasoning revealed chilling practicality. He did not believe he was insane. He believed he was being efficient. Yet while Kroll found his explanations convincing, the people around him paid the price. For every plate placed on his table, there was a family robbed of a loved one. Their loss was hidden behind his empty words about groceries, words he would repeat calmly to police. While he continued his ritual at home, outside the walls of his apartment, others were blamed, arrested, and punished for murders Kroll alone had carried out. How did innocent men suffer while Kroll remained free? The tragic truth is that early investigations into his murders led to charges against men who had no connection to the crimes at all. One of the first and most devastating cases was that of Heinrich Ott. After the murder of Clara Tesma in 1959, Ott came under suspicion. For investigators under constant pressure from the public and local officials, Ott appeared to be the answer they needed. They placed him at the center of the investigation and quickly built their case around him. In reality, there was no solid evidence linking him to Tesma's death. Yet, the fear of admitting that they had no leads made Ott a convenient suspect, and as a result, he was made to carry the burden for a crime committed by Joachim Kroll. Ott was formally charged and sent to prison. Life inside the facility was difficult, even for proven offenders. But for someone innocent, the experience became unbearable. Reports from the period suggest that he never escaped the weight of being labelled a murderer. He lost his freedom, his reputation, and his chance for a normal life again. With no real way to clear his name and little hope for release, Ott struggled. Eventually, despair overtook him completely. He took his own life while behind bars, leaving behind the cruel reminder that one man's crimes had already claimed victims who were never attacked directly. Kroll had taken not just lives, but freedom and sanity through the shadow cast by his repeated murders. The case of Heinrich Ott exposed cracks in police procedure. Rather than pause to admit that the evidence was thin, investigators pushed toward a conclusion. In doing so, they satisfied short-term demand for justice, but compromised the integrity of the system. The public, relieved at the thought a killer had been caught, stopped asking questions. For them, the funeral of Clara Tesma had been followed by an arrest and conviction. The case appeared closed. Yet the real killer, the man living quietly in the Ruhr Valley, moved freely. Ott's death by suicide became a bitter reminder of how much trust had been misplaced. Ott was not the only wrong man targeted by these investigations. Another case that drew attention was that of Walter Quicker. Like Ott, he came under suspicion after the murder of a woman in Duisburg. Once again, police felt the demand of a terrified community. Families wanted answers. Local officials demanded results. The public expected killers to be caught quickly. When another woman turned up dead, pressure grew intense. Quicker, who lived in proximity and whose life held details investigators thought suspicious, was pulled into questioning. He became another target. Once again, the police tried to mold the few fragments they had into a case against him. The law enforcement system in the Ruhr during the 1950s and 1960s made these errors more likely. Cities like Duisburg, Essen, and Dortmund all fell under different jurisdictions. Police forces worked their own records, and the technology of the time offered no way for automated links. When one murder occurred in Essen, those files rarely crossed into Duisburg, even if the crimes shared clear features. This lack of coordination meant officers faced only the evidence of their own towns. Each death looked new and unique. Without the full context, suspicion was easier to apply to innocent locals, while the larger picture went unseen. The broader public fear added weight to these mistakes. Communities lived with the constant knowledge that women had been attacked and killed. Parents kept children close. Couples avoided lone walks after dark, and families demanded action. Police felt judged daily for their ability to manage the crisis. Arresting a suspect temporarily relieved that pressure. It gave the sense that order had been restored. But the price was steep. Not only were innocent men blamed, but true justice was delayed. The killer went on, continuing attacks while police nodded at the relief of case closures that never truly solved the danger. Wrongful accusations pulled ripples across entire towns. Each name accused meant families and friends of the suspect lived under a cloud of suspicion. In small, tightly woven communities, a family's reputation mattered. Being linked to murder meant lost work, broken friendships, and deep shame. When suspects gave in to pressure and confessed under interrogation, investigators sometimes used those words as proof. Even if a confession later crumbled, the suspicion never fully left. Ott's death in prison was the most tragic mark, but every wrong accusation spread trauma through families who had already been innocent bystanders. Researchers studying the impact of wrongful convictions note that trust in institutions erodes quickly in cases like these. Communities begin to doubt whether police protect them at all, or simply move bodies through the system to maintain order on paper. In the Ruhr area, this doubt grew stronger each time another body appeared, after someone had already been declared guilty. People asked how a killer could keep striking if the murderer had been caught. This sense of confusion only made investigations harder as false leads layered on top of one another. It was not just Kroll hiding in plain sight. It was the collective weight of errors that gave him cover. As time passed, some investigators began to see unnerving similarities between cases. Strangulation was repeated often. Victims were found abandoned in rural spots not far from ordinary walking routes. In several instances, evidence of post-mortem abuse surfaced. These details should have raised alarms earlier, but with cases spread across different towns, no one force had the whole picture. One department believed they had closed their murder. Another opened a new one without seeing the pattern. Decades later, when Kroll finally confessed, the scale became clear. All those scattered cases were really chapters of one story, with one predator linking them. By the time police pieced together the truth, the damage had already been done. Innocent men forced to live under suspicion, communities robbed of trust, and a system shown to be unprepared for someone like Kroll. Heinrich Ott had died inside his prison cell, leaving behind despair and unanswered questions. Walter Quicker had felt the heat of false suspicion. Families of victims had been told justice was served when it never was. All the while, Kroll walked freely, planning his next attack. The wrongful accusations show how justice can harm as badly as it protects when driven by fear and urgency. A conviction satisfied the surface, but distracted from the deeper threat. In the shadow of these mistakes, Kroll grew bolder. As he learned more about his ability to evade police, his targets began to change. His escalation would lead him down an even darker path, one where even younger victims fell into his routine. How did Joachim Kroll avoid capture for 20 years? The answer lies in how he moved, not only during his crimes but also in his everyday routine. The Ruhr Valley, where he lived most of his life, was crowded with industrial towns connected by rail and bus routes. Duisburg, Essen, Dortmund, and many smaller places were all close enough that workers travelled daily between them. This constant movement gave cover to someone like Kroll. He was not restricted to one city, and his crimes followed the same shifting pattern. Each time he chose a different location, he bought himself more time before suspicion could fall on him. At the time, police forces in these towns investigated crimes strictly within their own borders. Duisburg police covered Duisburg, Dortmund police handled Dortmund. The idea of a killer moving between cities was not impossible, but the tools to prove it were not in place. There was no national database. Files were kept locally, information was written by hand, and connections had to come from memory or luck. If two murders occurred only 30 kilometers apart, but in two different jurisdictions, the cases might never be compared. This separation meant that Kroll could leave bodies behind in multiple districts and continue walking freely, his name never appearing in anyone's notes. Investigators were, in many ways, looking down at their feet rather than across the wider map. Their work was bound by limited resources and methods from the 1960s and early 1970s. Forensic technology was far behind where it is now. Fingerprints were compared by hand. Trace analysis was minimal. Murders were solved through witnesses or confessions more than anything else. And in Kroll's case, he left behind very little that tied him personally to the scene. He chose isolated areas, targeted victims walking home late, and killed quickly. By the time a body was found, he was already in another city. This spacing was not only geographic but also temporal. Kroll did not kill every week or even every month. Sometimes, years passed between murders. This irregular pacing slowed any chance of connecting events. Unlike killers who strike often and spur quick notice, Kroll learned patience. He could wait until he felt safe again before acting. When combined with his shifting locations, this made him incredibly hard to track. Each crime became an isolated tragedy rather than part of a larger string, and police treated them as such. In Essen, for instance, investigations into murders of women took on a very local tone, handled almost like standalone cases. Meanwhile, authorities in Duisburg or Dortmund faced their own mysteries. Each unit asked the same questions, struggled with the same limited evidence, but rarely shared with one another. The scattered nature of these efforts meant that collective recognition, the idea that they were all facing the same man, never surfaced until far later. The killer walking between their towns was invisible, because no one force had the full picture of his movements. Something else made matters more confusing. The Ruhr region at this time was plagued by multiple violent offenders. It was not only Kroll committing murders, reports of other attacks, some by unrelated killers, diluted the pattern. One crime of strangulation might be compared to another in the same city, but when countless violent incidents overlapped, the clarity of a single predator blurred. This worked entirely in Kroll's favor. His murders became part of the noise, difficult to separate from the chaos of wider violence. Local police sometimes thought they had solved things when another suspect was caught for a different crime, further scattering the narrative. Kroll also blended in through his working-class lifestyle. That cannot be overstated. His jobs at factories and in small roles gave him reason to travel and reason to be out late at night. He dressed like any other labourer. He carried himself without incident. When you add this to the spread-out nature of his crimes, there seemed no thread that investigators could realistically grab hold of. At a glance, he was one man among thousands. His victims appeared to fall in random places that had no apparent link aside from tragedy. Police procedures themselves added to the confusion. Arrests were often made quickly, sometimes based on weak evidence or public suspicion. When someone like Heinrich Ott was charged, officials were less likely to keep looking for further suspects. These closures, though false, parked cases in files that might never be revisited. Kroll, meanwhile, saw indirectly that suspicion had fallen elsewhere. This emboldened him. He learned that he could step into another town, repeat his cycle, and no one would chase him across municipal boundaries. A predator feeding on systemic weakness had found the perfect territory. The lack of shared databases cannot be overstated. Today, modern investigators use combined systems to compare evidence across regions. DNA matches, digital maps, and national records allow patterns to be seen quickly. In Kroll's era, those tools did not exist. The only way officers in Dortmund could learn of a similar case in Essen was through personal word or news reports, and even then the specifics often did not align. Murders were covered in local papers as isolated dangers. Few readers made connections, seeing them instead as unrelated tragedies in hard years. When Kroll was caught at last and gave his confessions, the scope stunned authorities. He spoke of murders spread across decades, scattered across different towns. Suddenly, names that had stood alone in files became grouped under one man's actions. Families who thought they had witnessed unique tragedies learned that their loved one was among a larger count. Investigators who believed they had isolated mysteries found their work tied together by one killer's words. The scale reflected not only his persistence, but also the way the police structure of the time had hidden him in plain sight. Each separate jurisdiction had been holding fragments, and only after confession were those fragments finally joined. It is easy to assume that someone like Kroll operated with cunning plans. In reality, he took advantage of geography and routine systems. By spacing his crimes, crossing boundaries between Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg, and smaller towns, and waiting patiently between murders, he tricked the era's limited investigative methods. For 20 years, that strategy kept suspicion away from him. Ordinary commuting workers masked him, overlapping crimes distracted police, and unshared records made his name invisible to anyone searching. Looking back, what stands out most is the silence between towns. Investigations ran in parallel, side by side, yet never crossed to form a full picture. In that silence, Kroll moved for 2 decades, repeating the same pattern without restraint. His cunning was not brilliance, but persistence. sustained by the absence of communication. It gave him freedom to kill in one town and then vanish into the crowd in another, before questions even formed. The end of that freedom came not through databases or coordination, but through a single child abuse case, a blocked pipe, and a neighbor's casual remark. For years, his spacing strategy kept him safe. Then, in 1976, his murder of 4-year-old Marion Ketter created circumstances no avoidance could contain. This time, there was no space to hide. Why did kidnapping one young girl unravel his entire secret? In July 1976, the life of 4-year-old Marion Ketter ended in a way that would expose everything Joachim Kroll had hidden for more than 2 decades. Marion lived with her family in the town of Frintrop, a district in Essen within the Ruhr Valley. It was a familiar area filled with family homes, workers walking home after long shifts, and children playing outside in the summer light. On that day, Marion disappeared from her neighborhood, and what followed was hours of frantic searching that shook every neighbor who knew her. For families living in close communities, the disappearance of a child meant panic. Parents rushed out into the streets, calling her name. Doors opened, neighbors stepped outside, and the search grew as people spread down paths, courtyards, and alleys. Everyone hoped Marion had simply wandered too far. Yet, as the hours went on, the sinking fear grew. This was not just a case of a child getting lost. She had been taken. The disappearance triggered strong alarm with local police as well. Germany in the mid-1970s had seen major crimes before, but a missing 4-year-old demanded immediate attention. Officers received calls from residents and began combing the area. In small communities within the Ruhr, crimes involving children pulled everyone into action. People formed groups, searching nearby rivers and fields. Yet as the night passed and no sign of her appeared, worry turned heavier. Marion's parents faced the reality no family ever wants, that their child may have fallen victim to someone who meant harm. The key break, however, did not come directly from the searchers outside. Instead, it came from something far stranger: clogged plumbing in the Kroll apartment block. Within the building, tenants began to notice water rising in sinks and baths. Complaints went out that the pipes were blocked. To those nearby, it was an inconvenient domestic problem in the middle of an already tense time. But when plumbers and police turned their attention to the drains, they found signs no one could have expected. Suspicion turned immediately upward. The investigation led to Kroll's flat. Police entered expecting maybe a violent man who had disposed of an animal or some unexplained act, but they found evidence that was far worse. Inside, they saw remains belonging to Marion. The smallness of the evidence told them at once what they were dealing with. A child had been brought into this apartment and partially disposed of. Drawers held packages of material, and the fridge carried tissues preserved like ordinary leftovers. What had been clogging the pipes turned out to be evidence of a crime. It was in those moments that the scale of Kroll's crimes began to surface. The police who had entered for a plumbing complaint now confronted the apartment of a killer who had operated unseen for nearly 21 years. Marion Ketter's death forced open what neighbors, families, and officers alike had missed for so long. Through a small child's disappearance and a set of backed-up pipes, one of Germany's most prolific murderers was finally exposed. When arrested, Kroll did not react with shock or attempts to deny his actions. Reports describe him as calm, almost passive, offering admissions without much resistance. In questioning, he made statements that startled the investigators. He believed that after his arrest, he would simply be given a medical operation that would cure him and then allow him to return to his life. His comments revealed how distanced he was from the gravity of his own crimes. He spoke not as a man grasping the enormity of years of killings, but as someone who thought his acts could be explained as illness, medically correctable, with freedom waiting afterward. As questioning deepened, one admission led to another. Police had expected maybe 1 or 2 deaths linked to Kroll, but soon learned that his history reached back decades. He admitted to attacks across multiple towns, stretching back to the 1950s. Investigators who had files on unsolved murders began recognizing details that matched his words. Victims' names resurfaced: Irmgard Strahl in 1955, Erika Schulter in 1956, Clara Tesmer in 1959, and many more in the years between. By the time Kroll finished speaking, he had tied himself to at least 13 murders and 1 attempted murder. The calmness with which he spoke troubled officers. He described his killings and what he did afterward with clear memory, but no emotion. The earlier explanations he gave that he acted in certain ways to serve practical needs were repeated again. He talked about his acts as if they were part of his daily existence, habits no different than choosing what to cook for a meal. Investigators faced a chilling reality. Kroll was not revealing delusions, nor odd visions. He was methodically telling them how he had shaped 2 decades of his life around murder, ritual, and survival habits. For families of earlier victims, his confession meant both heartbreak and relief. Some finally knew what had truly happened to their loved ones after years of unresolved grief. Others felt fresh anger, realizing that in some cases, innocent men had already been accused in place of Kroll. What connected every family was the weight of learning that their loss had been part of a larger pattern, hidden only by how far this man had traveled and how patient he had been. The realization deepened the shock. He had been walking among them the whole time, working quiet jobs, nodding in stairwells, and returning home to manage the aftermath of his crimes. The story of Marion Ketter's disappearance stood apart because it showed how ordinary circumstances can end even the most hidden killing career. A 4-year-old girl vanished, people searched, and nothing was found until an almost unrelated household problem opened the truth. It showed how crime sometimes reveals itself not through brilliant policing, but through chance, mistakes, or daily inconveniences. The drain clogged, the neighbor complained, and the mask Kroll had worn for years broke in an instant. Once his admissions were recorded, there was no going back. Authorities had evidence from his flat, remains in his kitchen, and detailed confessions that matched unsolved files. Kroll was not only tied to Marion's death, but to a shocking number of others. The investigators, stunned by the count, realized that they were dealing not just with a murderer, but one of the most destructive figures their country had known. His own words had provided the final proof. Through calm confessions and matter-of-fact explanations, he connected himself directly to victims, stretching across decades. At least 13 dead, 1 more attacked and left alive, and all of it hidden behind the face of a quiet factory worker that no one had truly looked at. The Ruhr Cannibal had been caught, exposed not by design but by a child's disappearance and the attention of neighbors. The arrest answered questions, but left one final step. All the fragments of tragedy, all the files gathering dust in different towns, now needed to come together in court. The trial would give shape to the years of violence, to the wrongful arrests, and to a public forced to confront that one of their seemingly harmless neighbors had been murdering for decades. After years of silence and mistakes, Germany had finally uncovered its hidden predator. What happens when the full story finally reaches the court? For years, the details of Joachim Kroll's crimes had spread only in fragments, through police files and whispers in communities. But in 1982, everything came into public view when his trial opened. The process was massive, lasting 151 days and drawing the attention of both Germany and international observers. The courtroom became a stage where horrors concealed for decades were spoken aloud, each victim's story retold, and each detail of Kroll's actions recorded in testimony. The scale of evidence meant that the court needed time. Much of the focus rested on the stories of specific victims and how Kroll described what he had done to them. Prosecutors detailed the circumstances of each identified murder. The trial faced the difficult task of comparing Kroll's confessions with what had already been recorded in unsolved cases. Some of his admissions matched perfectly to long-standing files, while others revealed gaps that police had missed. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. Each day in court added to the picture of how one man, unnoticed for so long, had carried out attacks across the Ruhr Valley. The public reaction revealed just how sheltered most people had been from the scale of his crimes. Hearing the acts in full detail shocked audiences. Testimony revealed murder, cannibalism, and child abuse. Each of these alone could shake a community's sense of safety. Combined, they redefined the way the Ruhr region looked at its own neighborhoods. For those who had been neighbors, or even co-workers, of Kroll, learning that he had committed such extreme acts was almost impossible to process. The trial forced these details into daylight, dismantling the thin, protective layer of ignorance that communities had lived under. During the trial, prosecutors charged Kroll with 8 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. This represented the crimes they could prove beyond argument in court, but Kroll himself had confessed to at least 13 killings, and investigators suspected the number might have been higher still. Some murders he admitted to lacked complete forensic evidence or detail that could be matched, leaving families in uncertain positions. The gap between legally proven charges and the larger scope of his confessions left a haunting question. How many lives had he really taken? The testimony showed patterns traced all the way back to his first known victim in 1955. Judges, lawyers, and the public heard how he strangled his victims, how he carried out sexual acts once they were dead, how he cut flesh from certain parts of their bodies to take home, and how he cooked those pieces in his kitchen. These were not details that could be minimized or softened. They were presented as plain facts, part of his established rituals. For many listening, The trial became less about guilt, because there was no doubt, and more about hearing the full extent of what he had been hiding. Throughout the proceedings, Kroll himself remained disturbingly detached. Accounts from the trial describe him speaking calmly, never raising his voice, and never expressing obvious remorse. In his own view, he appeared more confused by the world's reaction than ashamed of his actions. What surprised both prosecutors and the public was his claim during trial that he believed a surgical procedure could cure him. He suggested that after such an operation, he would no longer feel the drive to kill or consume flesh, and then he could be released. The statement revealed not only a lack of understanding of the weight of his crimes, but also showed the way he compartmentalized them as impulses he thought a doctor could fix, rather than choices he repeatedly made. For the families of his victims, hearing his casual tone amounted to a second wound. They witnessed not an apology or even acknowledgement of the human devastation, but a man treating 2 decades of murder as a condition to be corrected. People left the courtroom, carrying the weight of his detachment. His words, while shocking, also stripped away lingering questions about whether remorse had ever crossed his mind. It became clear that part of his shield, what had allowed him to live unnoticed, was his ability to drift through life without expression or concern. That attitude remained with him, even as he faced the sum of his actions in court. After months of testimony and review, the court delivered its conclusion. Joachim Kroll was sentenced to life imprisonment. The decision reflected both the proven murders and the recognition that he represented a continuing danger. In Germany at that time, life imprisonment was among the heaviest punishments available, ensuring he would never again return to the streets where he had taken so many lives. The trial's outcome was definitive, an ending point for the long cycle of killings and false arrests that had preceded it. His reign of violence finally closed behind a prison door. Inside, Kroll lived out only a short number of years. Reports differ on whether his death occurred in 1990 or 1991, but in either case, he died in custody, ending any chance he could ever speak further on his crimes. Some hoped that in prison he might reveal even more details or be studied more deeply, but his death cut that short. For researchers, the case left unanswered questions, but for communities, it meant closure. He would never leave prison alive. The legacy of his crimes spreads beyond him. In the Ruhr, memories of his murders are tied not only to victims but also to the innocent men who were accused in his place. Names like Heinrich Ott remain reminders of how much damage wrongful convictions inflict. Communities carry those stories alongside the grief of victims' families, the failures of police coordination, the speed of public pressure feeding into desperation for suspects, and the ease with which people dismissed an odd but quiet neighbour are remembered as lessons. The shadow of Kroll's trial also lingers in broader discussions of how societies handle offenders who blend into ordinary life. His case showed the danger of assuming danger wears a visible face. Neighbours described him as strange yet harmless. Employers found him dull yet steady. None suspected he was storing human flesh in his refrigerator. It became a lasting example that monstrous crimes can happen next door without clear warning signs. Even decades later, his story remains a caution. Families in the region have passed down memories of the fear his murders created, of the way suspicion spread and trust eroded. Wrongful arrests have been studied as case studies in how investigative errors multiply when police forces do not share information or pursue evidence carefully. For the Ruhr, healing has taken years, but the story endures as one of the most infamous examples of overlooked violence in German history. What lingers most is this: a man who seemed too dull to be dangerous managed to terrorize communities for over 2 decades. The trial not only held him accountable, but also forced everyone to confront how easily ordinary appearances can hide extraordinary cruelty. His life sentence did not erase the harm, but it finally ended the years of unchallenged killing. His case continues to stand as a sharp reminder of the violence that can live quietly, even right next door.